reviewing policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any questions, Councillor Cooper?
And I'm happy to move the recommendation.
No,
I'm sorry, I'm just, because it's on the table, to receive the report.
I'm going to receive the report. That'll be it.
No, I mean not the report, receive the presentation from the local board.
I'm sorry, okay.
I'm not trying to usurp your role, Mr Chairman. So,
you asked your question.
yeah, that's what I'd like to do, thanks. So in terms of the pest weed control in the ranges, we've got the regional part, but in the other areas under the local board control, are you promoting the idea of communities adopting a spot and things like that, you know, rather than having AT just go blithely through the area, doing it the way they're doing it currently?
I'll just quickly, we're not actively, I mean, we haven't advertised and things like that, but we would certainly be supporting any community that wants to adopt a spot. The other thing I neglected to mention was also, since throughout this term we have advocated to Auckland Transport and Parks to, but Auckland Transport to better respect the no spray register and adhere to the rules and the register itself. I think Neil wants to say something.
With regards to the transport corridor, there are limitations around community access because in some areas the health and safety issues are just too intense. But there are a number of ways that Auckland Transport could be working in the road corridor, and Waitakere in its day was actually quite forward around that. And that's just realising that there's native plants growing there, there's weeds. It's not just a drive in there and blast everything kind of approach. There's an integrated approach which could work easily, and it has worked in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Holtz. Deputy Mayor, thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Cooper's asked half of it, and I'm going to try not to make this a patsy question. What I really wanted to ask was, do you think that the way that Waitakere Council, the Eco-City, was managing its weeds was a good way? And should we continue that way? So I won't ask that question.
I don't think it's
instead I'll ask. Instead, I do just need to clarify and be really clear that I'm hearing this. This is, Saffron, you've made the point really clearly. The review isn't really needed if the review is simply to be based around concerns around glyphosate. Are you saying that we should minimise and reduce harm but continue with the policy and implement it well?
Thank you, Councillor Holtz. Yes, in a nutshell, the policy itself has an objective to do that. So that's what we're saying. We're saying that the policy itself is a very robust policy. It's taken a long time to create, to make, in consultation, very, very good consultation with community and experts. It provides a very good, thorough policy which both looks at and acknowledges the threat of ecological weeds as well as the threat of carcinogenic or toxic sprays to human health. So, and I would say that Waitakere Council was better managing the weeds in our particular area, at least, because there was a lot more local knowledge, but that's a bit of a procurement issue as well. But, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Casey.
It's a similar question, but maybe more forthright, Saffron. Successive speakers today have asked us to have a look at a precautionary approach and an immediate moratorium on glyphosate, and this is foreshadowing that debate will probably take place today, as there will be a motion put. Can you tell me what your board's response to that would be if there was an immediate moratorium on glyphosate?
I'll just respond to this one. I understand that in urban areas, around schools and parks, I don't see any reason why we need to use glyphosate. We're largely not even dealing with weeds. You know, this is for edging road corridors, edging parks with grass. I mean, it's grass. Glyphosate's good at killing things, and it's being used indiscriminately in that respect. I understand that there's a more difficult role around glyphosate and use in some of the areas that we work in the Waitakere Ranges. The project that Saffron mentioned around climbing asparagus, glyphosate was used with that, and it's very effective. But I see that as a sort of a transition process as well. I actually seriously think we need to look long and hard at some of the weeds that we're dealing with to see whether they are the priorities that we are placing them in. I think climate asparagus is very important. It will always be an issue. As far as a moratorium is concerned, I would be happy to see one tomorrow in the urban areas. And I think the rest of the board would agree with me on that.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, I'll thank Saffron and Neil for coming in this morning and your presentation, seconded by Councillor Fletcher. I'll put that motion. Those in favour? Aye. Against? Declare that carried. Now I'm going to move a procedural motion that we move item 13, approval of the scope of the weed management policy review, to be up to this position here. Happy to seconded by Councillor Fletcher. I'll put that motion. Those in favour? Aye. Against? Declare that carried. So before we get to that, we'll just do there's no extraordinary business and there's no notice of motion. So we now come to item 13, which is this item, approval of the scope of the weed management policy. Have you got the? I'm going to move, and Councillor Anai is going to second, that we receive the report entitled Approval of the Scope of the Weed Management Policy Review, and 2 is that we recommend the Weed Management Political Advisory Group be reappointed and continue to monitor and review implementation of Council's weed management policy and practice.
Yep.
So that's on the floor, and I'm going to speak to that briefly. And this came as a surprise that the Mayor, he's not here, but that he came out with this idea of reviewing the policy. And, you know, I think, and if councillors will recall, the previous council in August 2013 finalised the weed management policy, and that kind of there was a bit of inertia in implementing, and I think Councillor Darby came to the council and asked some pretty searching questions in relation to what was happening, and had the bodies that had been, you know, talked about, especially the Best Practice Reference Group and the Weed Management Political Advisory Group. We were wanting those, or asking why they hadn't been set up and where we were with our implementation. So I think that really got us into action, and the 2 groups were put in place, and the political advisory group consisted of members of the governing body, there was representatives of the governing body, representatives of local boards, and also representative of the Independent Marriage Statutory Board. And I think that group, that group has done some very good work in a pretty short time frame. And we've had the operational side of council at the table, or coming and reporting at those meetings, and I think we've got some good responses from Auckland Transport, Parks and Reserves of this council, and also Watercare as to what practices they are following. And I think we've also had the Best Practice Reference Group appointed, and they've come and made one appearance, I think, at the Political Advisory Group. And I think that the work that they gave or presented was very helpful. So I think we've made a considerable amount of progress, and I don't at this stage believe that taking this matter or further and getting into another review, which is what was kind of inferred with this, and now the subject of this report, is going to get us very far very quickly, because I think the work of the Weed Management Political Advisory Group has been helpful. I think that work should continue in the next council, and there will be a number of councillors and local board members who are familiar with the practices and the work of the group back, I'm certain, in the new term of council. So I ask councillors to support that. It's interesting that there was a mood, I think, from the presenters this morning, and the Waitakere Rangers board kind of had that view that we should get on and do the work and not go into another review period, because I think that could put us back operationally developing best practice. So I ask councillors to support this way forward, and ask if there's any other speakers. Councillor Walker.
Questions?
Councillor Kate. Well, okay. Question, you got a question?
Yeah, it's a question of Mr. Kimpton. Mr. Kimpton, we've been visiting sites across Auckland as part of the Audit and Risk Committee to look at health and safety issues. And throughout the presentations today, I've been concerned about the health and safety of the public with regard to our use of what the World Health Organization has termed carcinogenic material. And we're about to discuss a moratorium amendment, but I'm asking you about whether you've done any research or analysis of the risk to the public of us, as the council, applying pesticide to the street.
Look, thank you for the question, Councillor Casey. Auckland Council itself does not analyse the risk of a particular chemical. It relies on the EPA to provide that advice. It also relies on the EPA to provide us guidance on what best practice use is on the use of a chemical, in this situation glyphosate, and we adapt our own practice to make sure that it at least meets best practice, if not our expectations as a wider organisation. So when the question that you're asking really goes to this debate that we're having right now is, do we use glyphosate or not? Well, Council's not in a position to judge that matter. It relies on others, and then we also rely on those organisations to provide us best practice. And that's probably the best I can do in terms of an answer. But we would take the same approach for other matters of safety and public health and safety in the design of public open spaces. So the policy and practice that we use, whether it's a chemical or whether it's a playground or whether it's a road or a footpath, same practice occurs across all of those, because they all have an impact on public health and safety.
Can I just ask one more question for follow-up? In light of the World Health Organization's pronouncement on glyphosate, that was last year, who's our expert in council that, under the new health and safety legislation, we have a different set of responsibilities now than we used to have. Who's our expert in council that can appraise us of the EPA's decision-making? Because what bothers me is that we're hearing it's banned all over the world, and yet we're still using it because we're relying on this other body. Who's our expert that looks at that on our behalf?
So two comments. One is certainly the information I'm getting varies depending on the source as to whether it's banned or not banned. Our source is the EPA. Yeah. And we don't employ people to second-guess the EPA or get in between the EPA and World Health organisations. And that's been a strategic decision, and that is a correct decision for us as an organisation. We're able to rely on expert other sources. So quite honestly and quite frankly, that is the approach that we use. And we would not employ experts to sit in between. But we do have expertise in the organisation on how to guide best practice and the management of any chemical.
Thank you. Well, just you want to speak to the motion?
I have a question of Mr. Kimpton.
Okay.
So my question, Mr. Kimpton, is that in the past, previous councils, and I'm talking about North Shore City and Auckland City, relied on evidence from the community and doctors around the health effects of sprays on people in public spaces, parks, playground and elsewhere. And there was considerable evidence, and evidence from doctors, that was provided to those councils. And it was on that basis that those councils took glyphosate off playgrounds and off streets. Now, has this council sought evidence from doctors and members of the public around health effects of members of the public coming into contact with sprays through inhalation, through absorbing it through their skin if kiddies are playing in a playground and elsewhere? And this is a question that goes to health and safety. Can I ask it?
Ask the question.
So, who in our council advises us specifically on the health effects that our people experience in playgrounds, in parks, coming into contact with glyphosate and other chemicals? Not the EPA. Who in our council? Because EPA exists at a high level.
Oh, stop.